Whether you are the believing Christian, a seeker of wisdom, or simply intrigued by the wonders surrounding solitude, this video will resonate with all. Because within the Gospels lies a mystery few dare to explore. Between the miracles and teachings, crowds and disciples, Jesus kept slipping away into what the ancients described as lonely, desolate places. And this action happened not once, not twice, but so often that the apostles made special note of it, willing himself away not only from the crowds that adored him, but also his close circle of disciples. Whether you view Jesus as God incarnate or the archetype of humanity's highest potential, solitude whispers something profound about what it means to be human. And as we will come to see, it is an essential necessity for mental health, as essential as the health, exercise, and food provide the body. It's a sacred, necessary space that's not only been lost amid the loud bells of the Christian praise for church and community, but also buried beneath the desirous distractions and constant connectivity plaguing modern society. Consider the paradox of Jesus' account. God became human to be with humanity, yet repeatedly chose to be alone. Questions arise. What is the purpose of spending time alone? What do you do in solitude? And why is this act so rare in modern times? And not only has this human act been drowned out and lost, but there's also an interesting stigma surrounding solitude in the collective consciousness. A stigma that we will come to see as justified, but nevertheless there lies a stigma that most unconsciously possess. Think about it. When a child misbehaves, they're sent to their room. A student acts up, they're isolated from their classmates. Similarly, in prison, a prisoner in trouble may be sent to a place called solitary confinement. Obviously, a large part of the stigma is fear-based, but there's also other reactions many unconsciously draw towards the idea of solitude. For example, if a group of friends asks you to come hang out with them, and you reply that you're intending to spend the night alone, the reaction may be of sorrow, feeling bad for you, or worry that something's wrong, or disgust, calling you a loser. Yet, behind it all, lies the divine irony of the biblical accounts of Jesus' moments in solitude. And it is through his example where our questions can be explored and the stigma broken. Now, you may be thinking I'm taking one line of scripture and making it out to be more than it is. The only reference I've used thus far is found in the book of Luke, where it's written that Jesus often withdrew to lonely places. But as you continue to look into his life with solitude in mind, you realize there has to be a point to it all. Take the simple yet puzzling line from the book of Mark. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went to a solitary place. He didn't just seek a solitary place in the home, find a quiet place to be one with the one he is already one with, but he deliberately sought out a desolate place to be completely alone. Again, regardless of how literal or allegorical you read Jesus' account, one has to ask why the God in flesh would have to will himself to a place to be alone. This deliberate act deserves as much respect and attention as the acts of healing and teachings he's performed. Perhaps we've overlooked something profound in the ancient narrative. So let us begin our journey into solitude in the beginning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. If the Word is God, then the Word and God are one. And if this is the beginning, then it's safe to say that the beginning is a rather solitary place. Just like your beginning, or my beginning, or any created being's beginning, the womb is a barren, lonely place life begins. Our first movements occur in solitude. It's a natural part of being, and yet, that stigma we discussed in the introduction continually haunts such naturalness, which leads us to the first account of Jesus in solitude. Just after his baptism, he is led, not by choice but by spirit, into the wilderness to spend 40 days in solitude, tempted by the devil. It's not a lovely, beautiful place of retreat, an escape, a vacation before he starts his mission, but a place almost all would avoid. And we see why this deeply rooted stigma surrounding solitude plagues us all, because it is in this space where one encounters such figures like the devil. Speaking of the devil, there's something rather curious to note about this figure in biblical accounts. We find this presence not only scattered throughout the New Testament, but also deeply rooted in the Old Testament as well. And of course, we still speak of this figure today. This consistency points at a space outside birth and death. The devil isn't bound by space or time, but exists in what we might call the archetypal realm, that mysterious space we all share in our collective consciousness, or rather collective unconsciousness. It is a metaphysical essence, and this essence is not sought after by Jesus to rid before his ministry, but it's encountered when solitude is entered. And it's a rather tempting encounter. Temptations are the realm of the psyche, that metaphysical space, and it represents impulses of desire that move through the mind of us all. So we already see before the teachings, the crowds, the disciples, Jesus entered solitude, and it served a metaphysical purpose. Through this, we are beginning to see the connection of solitude and the realm of the psyche take shape. Solitude seems to slip the door open of the underconsciousness, that unconsciousness moving within a conscious subject. Psychologically, the encounter with the devil is a nod to Carl Jung's concept of shadow work, that coming to communion with the parts of you that you'd rather keep in the dark. Solitude provides the right environment to have the presence of awareness to see such subtle inner movements. Because in solitude, the masks fall away, the performances end, and the raw psyche emerges. While these emerging movements may be of a good or holy nature, say the instinct to break out of an addictive, destructive habit, the psyche is whole, and movements also bring forth darker essences. No wonder the avoidance, the punishments connected to solitude. Even Jesus didn't choose to enter solitude to rid the devil. Again, he was led. But instead of hiding, repressing away the devil, asking God to get rid of it, taking a pill, seeking a therapist, distracting himself, Jesus faced it, and in that, it lost its influence. Without a heart-to-heart with that realm below, all remains as it is below, continually influencing its above. To this, one has to ask, if Jesus didn't spend time in solitude, those 40 days before his ministry, does the devil follow influentially in his footsteps? Bringing this to a more modern view, if one doesn't allow space to be with oneself, their tempting instincts, impulsive thoughts, and emotions hidden just below the threshold of conscious awareness, they all follow you in your footsteps throughout life. Think of a time when you acted, or better put, reacted, in a way you look back on in pity or confusion. Why did I do this? Where did this all come from? That wasn't, quote-unquote, me. Just as Jesus not only faced the devil, but was able to purify himself from such temptations, one facing their shadows loosens their energy within oneself and transforms their state of being. Again, one must ponder, if Jesus didn't spend time in solitude with his temptations, would the devil have influenced his ministry? And one last key point to note on the devil is that he's never killed by Jesus. While it doesn't come back to tempt Jesus in biblical accounts, there's an interesting line about the devil following Jesus' 40 days in solitude. When the devil had finished all this tempting, he left him until an opportune time. While solitude at first stimulates the fearful shadows, there is a purifying experience that follows. But this doesn't mean that the shadows just die. You cannot expect to enter solitude once and heal all shadows forever. Because just as the devil left him until an opportune time, the shadows are always waiting for the ego not only to give them energy, but to unconsciously possess it. Now, as we continue on in the account of Jesus, we find another important time solitude is entered. This time not for the purpose of unconscious purification, but for guidance, wisdom, intelligence, another connection between solitude and the psyche. Just before an important decision in Jesus' ministry, it is said in Scripture that Jesus went up to a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also designated apostles. Here, before choosing his apostles, Jesus entered solitude along a mountainside and prayed to God through the night. So we see in solitude, it's not just about facing unconscious forces within, but also a sacred space to gain wisdom, intelligence, even simple guidance on decisions in one's own life. And this is not to say information and knowledge cannot be gained outside you, but it's important to remember that intelligence also comes from within, and it's in solitude where that inner intelligence flourishes. Now there's an act that we continue to see throughout Jesus' time in solitude, the act of prayer, and I will later explore the importance to this in solitude, but I do want to veer away from the Christian story for a moment, because there's others throughout history whom also encountered this same truth. Consider Nietzsche. He is said to have discovered his most profound insights during long, solitary walks in the mountains, claiming that all his truly great thoughts are conceived while walking alone. Or the account of Nikola Tesla, whose most groundbreaking ideas didn't come in his lab, but came in complete isolation. Ideas like the alternating current motor came to him in vivid detail during these moments of solitary contemplation. Even someone like Albert Einstein emphasized this connection between solitude and insight. He wrote that the solitude of a quiet life stimulates the creative mind. His theory of relativity came to him in quiet moments of deep solitary thought. Anyone familiar with Carl Jung or watched my series on his Red Book will know that he came to his insights, that being his entire psychology, from his time spent alone with his unconscious. Maya Angelou knew this truth as well, as she would rent a hotel room to write alone for hours, understanding that certain voices only spoke when all others fell silent. What these figures understood was that it is not just about an absence of others. It's a presence of something else. Something that speaks only when one dares to be alone with herself. This is why Thoreau went to Walden Pond, why Virginia Woolf demanded a room of her own. They discovered that certain kinds of knowing, certain depths of understanding, certain heights of creativity only occur in that sacred space of solitude. So far we've seen how solitude excites the unconscious. It brings forth wisdom and intelligence. But there's also another side of the psyche that would help complete it whole, that being the emotional side. As we turn back to the account of Jesus, we see such an event. Jesus was informed that someone close to him, the man who baptized him, John the Baptist, died. The following scripture follows this news. When Jesus heard about what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. In most accounts of Jesus alone in solitude, we find him praying. The only accounts he doesn't pray are his 40 days with the devil and this event, where he takes a boat out alone. As I said, we'll get into the idea of praying soon, but for him to not be praying and to perform this act after such news seems to all point to some kind of emotional processing. As it's so easy to cover up emotions, to busy yourself, to attempt to not see them, to have support to ease it all. But similarly to shadow work, facing emotions, understanding your emotions, which are you, allows them to not be so unconscious and chaotic, so possessive, but rather consciously experienced, realized, and healed. Without the ability to face one's emotions, their energy possessively remains below, awaiting arousal. Now, I know there's nothing specific saying this is any kind of action of emotional processing, although one definitely can make the inference. But as I continue on in Scripture with this time alone, there may be no other reason for this action. As I continue in Scripture, when Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. The first insight to note is that the crowds were following him while he was all alone. An all-knowing, divine yet human figure whose mission is to be with people, to spread the good news, would know that a crowd is wanting to be with him. Yet he continues in solitude, alone, in a boat. And of course that all happens after just learning of the passing of a man who baptized him. And then secondly, more subtle yet eye-opening, is what happens when Jesus returns after solitude. He didn't return to land to be with the crowd. The scripture didn't say Jesus withdrew by boat to a solitary place, saw the crowds, and went to them to heal them. But rather he was alone in the boat. The crowds followed him. When he finally landed, not to be with anybody, but alone, he then saw the large crowd and then had compassion on them. And in my opinion, the notion of compassion drawing him to the crowds instead of just going towards them re-highlights the significance of solitude in the emotions. At first glance, solitude may seem selfish and egotistical. Yet you'll notice in the 3 examples we've explored, it serves beyond the mere individual. Yes, bearing evil impulses, cleansing consciousness of such unconsciousness serves your own state of being, but also the world around you. People outside wouldn't be victim to your evil or distorted impulses lingering just below the threshold of awareness. Receiving sparks of insight or creativity benefit you, but can also become something that benefit the world. Giving your emotions your full awareness and attention not only clear your own being from their possession, but also bring the subject to the archetypal reality of the emotions, providing one a natural empathy for others, as emotions are common to all beings. There are other events in Jesus' life we could explore where he enters solitude, such as when he, just after entering solitude in a boat following the news of John the Baptist's death, sends off a crowd of 5,000 he fed, along with his disciples, to be alone again. Or when aware of his imminent capture and death, he left his disciples multiple times to pray alone. But it's time to shift the focus off the effects of solitude and open up to what solitude is in itself. What is solitude? What causes one to be in solitude? And why is solitude different than just merely being alone? We'll begin with the reason why I chose the Christian literature, out of many other spiritual and practical examples, to focus in on solitude. Jesus' life is a life lived with balance at the cornerstone of its movement. This video, Solitude, is not about removing community from the human experience, and the way to well-being is solely found in escaping away from the world. But as Jesus shows, it is an essential part of the whole of being human. His example, unlike many other religious or spiritual traditions, provides a to and fro, in and out, and in solitude and in the world, a balance of which we can all use in our modern bias reaching to, out, and onto the world and its community of materials. Jesus is not someone hiding in a cave, walled in a church, nor solely living with the people and things of the world. He is both in the world and in himself, and thus lives the essence of life. In this, Jesus provides, in whichever way you view him, an example of a life lived in well-being, not being as you wish, nor as another wishes you to be, but the living of life itself. And so I say all this because solitude is the other side of community. They are opposites, and opposites, just like heads and tails, are 2 halves of the same thing. One affects the other, and their relationship is a depending factor of the whole system working in harmony or in distress. Without the earth, spirit is unconscious and uncreative, and without spirit, the earth is empty and lifeless. If you remove tails from a coin, it's no longer a coin. Thus, without solitude, or without community, the core of one's being is affected. These thoughts lead to something lingering in many of you, I'd suppose, because our world has entered, as many people say, a loneliness epidemic, where so many people are spending time alone, away from the community, and the true need is not a video embracing solitude, but a video on how to strengthen the human community. And this is a valid point. Not only the truth about many individuals, young to old, spending more time alone, but the fact that the human community is fragmented and conflicted. But when you think about it, who is actually spending time in solitude that is alone? Are there not video and phone calls, emails, websites, apps, messages, games, music, foods, stimulants, and the other 10,000 ways to fill the aloneness? Spending time alone has turned into an electric and stimulated community, a community of the 10,000 ways to fill the empty space. And you may notice, whenever you find yourself alone, that your instincts push through ways to the 10,000. You should eat. You should check in on this friend. You should play a new level in the game. Open that app. Clean. X, Y, and Z. This programming proves how uncomfortable being alone has become. So yes, our community is broken. But maybe it's a lack of embracing solitude that's destroyed the community. This makes no sense, but completely makes sense, because community and solitude are one and the same, and a community is made up of a group of individuals. And so, witnessing just how much community is lived today, you realize that solitude has lost its place in modern life. Being alone has become lonely, and individuals will to stimulate and distract such loneliness away. Solitude is truly rare, because solitude requires another will, a willingness to be alone with oneself. In Scripture, there's always an act into solitude. Jesus took a boat to be alone, went up to the mountainside, left the house. There is a willingness, say, to enter it. And so it is up to the individual to allow or distract it away. To distract or ignore solitude is to turn your back on your soul, and to enter it is to turn your back on the world. Entering solitude, it's willing, can be seen as a removal not only of people, but anything that'll distract or stimulate your awareness. As solitude is a place where awareness and attention are preserved for consciousness itself. Solitude is a true, incestual heart-to-heart, an act not for the health and well-being of the body, but the well-being of the realm of the mind, the psyche, the soul. Like the body which needs its essential necessities to function rightly, and without it breaks down, the psyche reflects the same. If you continue to eat without a moment of fasting, you'll become sick. If you move without stopping, at some point you collapse. If you stay awake without sleeping, you'll deteriorate. And so psychologically, if one is solely living in an outer connected community, the psyche breaks and fragments itself into it. But a will to be alone with oneself regathers such fragmentation. A blurry picture of solitude is beginning to take shape, so it is time to bring back something I've promised to speak on: prayer, as well as its relation to solitude. Just like solitude, our idea of prayer seems to have been distorted. Prayer in ancient times was not an egotistical act of begging, wanting, whining, but something other. And as we turn back to New Testament scripture, Jesus speaks directly on prayer. He says to his disciples, "And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father, who is unseen. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. And when you pray, do not keep on babbling like pagans, for they think they will be heard because of their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask Him." There's a lot to be said about these few words on prayer. First, before praying, Jesus says something the individual must do, an act of shutting the door, or metaphorically willing oneself alone into solitude, and this all happens before prayer. Additionally, this act of solitude and prayer is not directed towards anything physical, nothing of the world, but towards the unseen, which Jesus names the Father. An unseen essence as unseen as the psyche, as unseen as thoughts and emotions, as unseen as the instincts and temptations which arise from a space unknown. And this unseen spirit not only sees what is done in secret, in solitude, but rewards, or if ignored, punishes one accordingly. And the last and most essential point to add from this section about prayer is the limit of words used. Jesus says when praying, don't babble yourself away and distort conscious awareness, but it is the Father, or whatever name you want to provide the nameless, unseen essence, that knows what you need before you ask it. These thoughts turn prayer inside out, because it is not a prayer of our subjective wants, but a prayer for the needs of the unseen in us all. Continuing in Scripture, Jesus describes how to pray. "This, then, is how you should pray. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one." This prayer begins with an acknowledgement to the unseen it speaks to, and its will be done on earth, say the subject's conscious awareness, as it is in heaven, in the unconscious. Give us today our daily bread, that bread of which we need, and not just physical nutrition, but metaphysical nutrition. And forgive us our debts, our own sins that will linger within and haunt us, as we have forgiven our debtors. Because if one holds on to hate, anger, disgust to another, one only feeds such energies in one's own being. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. A closing message connected to the first example of Jesus in solitude. This prayer, like a meditation, is for the unseen and of the unseen, and it's performed after one metaphorically shuts the door, all beginning with the subject's willingness to be with itself. This is the deep mystery and sacredness of solitude. Being alone with oneself, dependent on nothing but oneself, brings together the conscious and unconscious mind. Usually the unconscious, the soul, is driven to and through the material world, but when the ego enters solitude, introverts its light, the two can be as one. And this is the archetype of solitude, because consciousness acts as a one. This leaves us with the last point to explore about solitude. Effects are nice, and the cause is important to understand to reap any effect. But how does one cause the cause? If I were a sheep, or in need of attention from the community, I would proceed to attempt to define a way or give you steps to solitude. Act as if I have something special to teach you. But the way to solitude, this practice, is for you and you alone. I titled this section Practicing Solitude because it is a practice. You cannot just sparingly or when it suits you say, hey, soul, father, self, or whatever name you name the nameless. I am here. I want intelligence. I want this emotion gone, this habit removed. But practicing solitude is a ritual in one's life like bathing. You do not bathe once and then expect to be clean forever. And so thus is solitude. Unfortunately, beginning this practice, like the beginning of any practice, is not easy. Not only are many not used to truly being alone with oneself, which is difficult in itself, but in the beginning the material one is in communion with are crude, raw, personal contents built up through one's life. It is not initially the heights of wisdom, emotional intelligence, spiritual enlightenment, the highest forms of being, but lower forms of consciousness. Consciousness is both personal and collective. The collective represents the essence of heaven, God, or the collective unconscious, while personal aspects or truths, as real to one's psyche or soul as its collective archetypes. Truths such as personal beliefs, complexes, and the like. In the beginning of spending time alone, it is these personal aspects of being which will be most prevalent. This is only logical. Personal, shallow contents of the unconscious are closer to conscious awareness than deeper, subtle movements. Not to say archetypal and collective aspects wouldn't surface, but the personal are more likely to play out in early moments of spending time with yourself. And these early moments of turning to face oneself is a difficult sight to bear. You witness a pathetic, scared, fearful, desirous, and conflicted soul. When anything becomes difficult, the masses have become accustomed to finding something or someone to help. But solitude doesn't allow such dependence, rather an independence. The independence so many wave around, but unfortunately never experience. Besides the beginnings filled with dark, personal muck, as well as not being able to depend on anything or anyone, there are other roadblocks which keep the masses from willing and practicing solitude, such as the lack of rules or steps to follow. But as I began this section, there are no steps to solitude. It is truly time and spaceless. Jesus willed himself to a boat, a mountainside, the wilderness, and left the house to enter nature alone. Solitude has no specific space to be, nor time, as it is entered in the morning and evenings, for hours or days. You could speak a prayer or remain silent. You could be still or walk. All that is necessary is for you to be with you and attend whatever you have to offer. This practice serves two purposes. The first is a personal purpose, solitude for the well-being of your being. This serves the shallow end of the unconscious, the personal unconscious, call it your shadow, soul, Atman. This provides oneself space to restore energy, to gain insights and issues in one's own outer life, spark new creative ideas, or process emotions one feels about someone or something. Another thing you'll notice that arise are subtle contents that others, willingly or unwillingly, placed into your personal unconscious.
My baloney has a first name.
For example, you'll notice jingles from commercials surface into conscious awareness when in solitude, shining a light of subliminal marketing tactics that have an unconscious possession over you. The second purpose for solitude is for the spiritual or divine, for the well-being of being. Call it the Father, the Spirit, the Self, the Brahman, the nameless essence. These purposes provide intelligence of the higher orders of nature, clear up and realign distorted archetypal impulses, unfold the deeper purposes of the emotions, and get to know the hidden truths behind the material world. Regardless of your own opinion of spending time alone with yourself, there's no denying the need for it, because without the respect to spend time with one's own being, nothing outside will fulfill the void. You'll corrode from the inside out and outside in, conflicted between what you outwardly want and what you inwardly need. To close out this section on practicing solitude, I want to pay respects for the dangers involved in this practice. Yes, one can be frightened by the realization of other movements moving without one's own conscious will. Old memories and traumas may revisit. Trapped emotions can flood mind and body. Years and years alone can make one go mad. The devil awaits one alone. Yes, there are dangers there, but what about the dangers of chaos unchecked? Many who want to dismiss solitude because of these dangers will claim individuals cannot bear the space. They are not ready. They are too weak. It will arise temptations and desires that will negatively influence them, or they will lose their sense of reality and go mad. But all of that which is fearful, weak, tempting, desirous, mad, and devilish is already what one is. It's in you and of you and is you. So yes, difficulties and dangers may arise, but without a heart-to-heart with the realm below, all remains as it is below, continually influencing its above. But when the above steps out of the programming, the fears, the need for community, and controlling of its consciousness, and gives consciousness space to unfold itself, then and only then is inner transformation and healing possible. And if all the dangerous contents of which solitude stimulates is what one already is, maybe 364 days a year the contents can be projected and repressed. But all it takes is one day where an inner explosion occurs and sets off psychological and physical actions of which the world is victim to, that of which you look back on in disbelief. So yes, there are dangers involved in practicing solitude, but the dangers of chaos unchecked is, in my opinion, more dangerous. As Carl Jung once said, it is only in the state of complete abandonment and loneliness that we experience the helpful powers of our own natures. Jung captures the helpful powers solitude carries along with it. In solitude, we step into a time and spaceless place where we can truly meet ourselves, our souls, and in doing so, begin the process of regathering a soul that has been hypnotized, scattered, and bound to the things of the world. It is a forgotten, eternal part of consciousness which bridges the gap between heaven and earth. And while we, as conscious aware egos, live in creation, aware of both the inner happenings and the doings of the outer world, the soul has its own inner happenings coming through a divine source outside the world of creation, while also having its own outer world. And that outer world is us. You are the outer world to the soul. Our own unique emotions, thoughts, experiences, images, beliefs, reactions, memories and traumas, complexes, the stimulations released from the foods and drinks one intakes, all are real materials to the soul. And thus, if we live a life solely outside in the world, the materials, the socials, the gossips, situations, stimulations, stresses, anxieties, thus is then the world of the soul. Just like the ego, who is distracted and stimulated to hear the callings of its soul, the soul cannot hear the callings of the spirit when it is filled up with personal energies. But through solitude, a soul is clearer to receive purer contents. And as the archetype of solitude is a conscious and unconscious union, the conscious ego receives what the soul receives. The two, instead of living in conflict, live in harmony. It is only natural. One thing to think about in the abandonment and loneliness of solitude is that the functions of consciousness have a moment to breathe, allowing them space to be opened and not closed or distracted and stimulated. They can attune to the natural and objective surrounding it. I believe this is why nature is a place many go when entering solitude, especially in Jesus' account. He left the house not only to clear the air of any distraction or influence, but to attune with the objective nature of which created the rocks, the trees, animals, and human, the force behind fire, air, and water. When alone in nature, with nature moving as it is, uninfluenced by subjectivity, consciousness can attune and harmonize with it. There are many people that go outside into nature, even alone, but bring with them their picnic, their phones, music, energy drinks, so much of what disturbs the environment necessary for solitude. Not to say one has to go full Thoreau and live alone in the woods for years. It is tough to be alone in our world, but beginning with the detachment of such distractions and stimulations helps one ease into the comfort of spending time with yourself. Watch yourself as you begin to practice solitude. You'll witness how much influence the personal unconscious programming has as it floods conscious awareness. You'll instinctually grab for your phone, notice thoughts you didn't think arise, get the urge to snack or drink, think of the future or past, entertain a fantasy of fears and the like. This is all good. This is how, especially in the beginning, solitude should feel. But continue practicing solitude, and you'll come to realize subtle changes happening in your moments of solitude, as well as how you show up and act in the world. A big influence on these thoughts about solitude, other than my own personal experience, is Carl Jung. Anyone familiar with his personal journals, his red and black books, will know solitude, alongside community, show up over and over again. Jung understood the balance between the two are fundamental to well-being. So he lived with an eye in and an eye out, in the world and in the psyche. In his introduction to his personal journal entries, it is noted, his sense of duality took the form of two alternating personalities, which he dubbed number 1 and number 2. Number 1 was the Basel schoolboy who read novels, and number 2 pursued religious reflections in solitude, in a state of communion with nature and the cosmos. This is that to and fro Jesus so beautifully captures, the balance necessary for a life of well-being, a balance the world so easily throws off. Even for Jung, in his early scientific and worldly life, living out personality number 1, his life was bias, off balance. Then suddenly, he was called away from science and the world to enter into solitude. And the call was not from his own choosing, not realized by reading a book or listening to the advice of another, but by the depths of his own consciousness. To wrap up this video, I want to read 2 quotes from Jung which speaks not only of solitude, its relationship to community, and its higher purposes, but also of the figure of Jesus. Jung says, "Everyone who becomes conscious of even a fraction of his unconscious gets outside his own time and social stratum into a kind of solitude, but only there is it possible to meet the God of salvation. Light is manifest in the darkness, and out of the danger the rescue comes." In his sermon on Luke 19:12, Meister Eckhart says, "And who can be nobler than the man who was born half of the highest and best the world has to offer, and half of the innermost ground of God's nature and God's loneliness? Therefore the Lord speaks in the prophet Hosea, I will lead the noble souls into the wilderness, and speak into their hearts, one with the one from the one, and in the one itself the one eternally." The layman identifies religion with a creed, that is, with the things done in the church. And yet, how can there be religion without the experience of the divine will? That is the reason why I do not identify religion with a creed. I can have a real communion only with those who have a same or similar religious experience, but not with the believers of the Word, who have never even taken the trouble to understand its implications and expose themselves to the divine will unreservedly. They use the Word to protect themselves against the will of God. Nothing shields you better against the solitude and forlornness of the divine experience than community. It is the best and safest substitute for individual responsibility. The self or Christ is present in everybody a priori, but as a rule in an unconscious condition to begin with. But it is a definite experience of later life, when this fact becomes conscious. It is not really understood by teaching or suggestion. It is only real when it happens. And it can only happen when you withdraw your projections from an outward historical or metaphysical Christ, and thus wake up Christ within. This does not mean the unconscious self is inactive, only that we do not understand it. The self, or Christ, cannot become conscious and real without the withdrawal of external projections. An active introjection is needed, i.e., the realization that the self lives in you and not in an external figure separated and different from you. The self has always been and will always be your innermost center and periphery, your scintilla and punctum solis. It is even biologically the archetype of order and dynamically the source of life. And so the final question on solitude remains, does one spend time with the source of life, with thyself, or place themselves above it all?